All right, we are live, hopefully. Let me see if I can try to share my screen, see if we get any better luck this time. Okay. We would like to share a web browser. How about that? Let's go ahead and bring that up. Okay. See if this works better than last time. Otherwise, I'm quite at a loss. Oh, good. Looks like it's sharing. Very good. All right. That is good news. Okay. That looks happy. All right. Let's see if we can share a web browser. Okay, we can share a web browser. Let's see if we can share some source code. That would be even better. MOOC. All right, POSA 15. Assignments, assignment 2. Let me go ahead and make the font bigger. All righty. Let's try this. See if this will work. Okay. Share Emacs. All right, so Emacs is being shared as well. That's good news. Okay, let's take that as a good sign. So welcome to the second live lesson and virtual office hour for the POSA communication MOOC. So far, we look like we're doing better than the first time we tried this when, quite unfortunately, I could speak, but I couldn't share any documents. It looks like that problem has been fixed. I have absolutely no idea why there was a problem before, but we'll just chalk it up to the challenges of doing robust cloud computing. So what we're going to cover today in the session is largely going to focus on the skeletons for programming assignment number 2, which I will go over here in just a minute. And naturally, I'm also happy, as always, to take any other questions that people might have about any topics that you would like to cover. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring up the editor window and see if I can get my screen to share again. All right, so I'm sharing my screen. Let me double check to make sure that that's also showing up. Hopefully you can hear me also. Okay, so I think we're in business. What I'm going to do in this session is talk about the skeleton for the second programming assignment. If you go to the class website, you'll see a link to the assignment, and you'll see a link to the assessment portion and the description of the steps for submitters and steps for reviewers and so on. So please take a look at that. If you go to my GitHub site, you will find the files we're about to look at here. You can find the description of the assignment here in index.html. This, of course, is written in HTML, so it's kind of ugly, but if you view it through a browser, it'll look just fine. And basically what this assignment is about is it's about taking the assignment you did for assignment number 1, which you may not be done with, by the way, which is fine. And it involves extending it so it will also work for not just started services, which is what it did the first time, but it also worked for bound services. And the cool thing about the way the assignment is designed is that started services and bound services work more or less the same way, certainly the same way from the client's perspective. And even on the implementation side, they're factored out into a framework based on a couple of different patterns to help make it easier to implement both types of services within a common framework. And this document here, the description document, tells you where to go to find information about what we're covering, talks about the overall structure of the application, talks about the use of the model view controller layer, talks about the various motivations to use patterns to simplify everything, and then gives you an overview of the files in the assignment, and then finally tells you what methods to fill in and where to get everything. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview. Let's now go take a look at the structure of the source code. We go inside the manifest file. We will see that some things that are similar to what we've done before, some things are a little different. So we have the same activities before. We have the activities for viewing and displaying and downloading, just like we had done in the previous course. Now we added two new services. One service is going to be the bound service, so it's download images bound service, and that'll run in one process, as you see here. And the other is going to be the download images started service, and that will run in a separate process. We could run them both in the same process. We could run them both in the same process as the client application. Just for sake of some diversity, I have the services running in different processes. Okay, so let's now go over here into the source directory. This should look pretty familiar by now. We've got our MVP file, which I think is pretty much the same as we had before, not a whole lot different. We have the same set of common files we had before. We have the same view stuff that we had before. There's one little tiny difference here. I'll just mention it briefly. If you take a look at the download images activity, you'll see that there's a menu option now. And if you click on the menu button in the application, it'll give you a choice of a couple of different menu items. And those menu items allow to choose either the use of a bound service or a started service to run the application. So you can switch back and forth. In fact, what you should do when you get your assignment number 1 completed, you should go ahead and copy those couple of files from assignment number 1, like the download images started service.java file and the request message and reply message and so on. And you should copy those files into the right places in assignment number 2. And that way you'll be able to have both implementations working together at the same time. And you can switch between them using the menu item. So that kind of shows you a couple other cool things with menus and menu inflators and so on. Other than that, the view part is pretty much identical. The utils part is pretty much identical. I think I fixed a couple of bugs people reported, so that should all be doing better. The presenter part is pretty much the same way as it was before. The bulk of all the changes have been pushed off into the model layer, which is kind of cool because that demonstrates the virtue of the model view presenter pattern. You can keep most things the same and then switch around and modify certain things, like you can change the way in which the services work, but you don't break other parts of the application. I think this is all pretty much identical to what was there before. If you go back and watch the previous walkthrough, you'll see what happens in the presenter layer. And now let's go ahead and peek inside the model layer. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. A lot of this code is very similar to what we had before, but we've added a few new things because of the fact that we have both a bound service and a started service. So if we go in here into image model, this is basically the class that's exposed out to the other layers, the view and the presenter layer. This is exposed for interacting with a model. You can see now that we have two different types of services. We have a bound service and we have a started service. Those are the two things you can pick. We keep track of which one you want to use. We also keep track of what implementation is selected based on the choice here. We keep a weak reference to the image presenter, as always. We've got the onCreate and onDestroy hooks here, which hopefully do the right thing. And you can see we create a bound service by default, although you can override that if you want to. When start download is invoked, this will be invoked by the presenter layer. This start download method just turns around and forwards to the image model impl and delegates to it the start download method. And of course, depending on which type of service is configured, it'll choose the right implementation. Here's the method that you will actually be called back by the view layer when you switch between the different services. This is the set service type method. You can see here it checks first to see if the requested service type is different from the service type that you've already got configured. If they're the same, we skip all this because we don't have to do anything. If they're different, we then go ahead and we'll check to see what kind of service type we're dealing with, whether it's bound or started, and we'll create the appropriate implementation class, either image model impl bound service or image model impl started service. And obviously your final solution should work equally well with either one, but we're focusing on the bound service for assignment 2. Then when we're all done, we call up to the or call into the impl layer to do the implementation and initialize the image model implementation. So let's go look at image model implementation. This is a handler. It's going to use this capability to get called back by the service after it's finished downloading the file or files. And we've got various weak references back to the presenter. When the onCreate method is called, we stash away the presenter's weak reference and then we bind to the service. This call, as we'll see, is a no-op for a started service, but it actually does something that's important for the bound service. But in either case, we call this hook method. On destroy, we'll go ahead and check to see if a configuration change is occurring. If so, we're going to ignore the what we're doing. Otherwise, we're going to unbind the service. Start download is an abstract method. This will be overridden by the bound service implementation versus the started service implementation. Here's bind service and unbind service. You can see by default they're no ops, so they don't have to be overridden for the started service, but they do have to be overridden for the bound service implementation. And here's the hook method that is inherited from, or the API is inherited from the handler class, and this is what's going to get called back by the service after it's done downloading an image. So it'll download an image and it will then send a message back to this hook method. This hook method will turn around and convert the message back into a reply message, and then it will send that message back to the presenter via the onDownloadComplete method, which will then ultimately arrange to get that turned back into a call to that will ultimately display the messages, or sorry, display the images after everything's done. Okay, so that's how that works. Let's go ahead and take a look at the image model impl bound service. This is the main class that you have to focus on in your implementation. So this is a subclass of image model impl, which means it inherits everything from image model impl and then adds a few new things. It's going to keep a reference to a reply messenger, and this is going to be passed to the service and is going to be used to return the image results via the handler. So actually, I think it's going to come back just via the handler, not the service result handler. Just change that a little bit. And here's the request message ref. This is a reference to the request messenger that's used to send a request to the download images bound service, telling it to go ahead and download an image. And we'll see how those things get set up in a second. Because this is a bound service, we have to implement the service connection, and here's how you do that. You create a new service connection instance, which in this case is anonymous. We don't really care to name it. We could, but we don't need to. And the onServiceConnected method is automatically called back when the request, when the service is finished being bound to the client in this case being the application's model layer. And you have to fill in the code here to do the right thing when onServiceConnected gets called back. And I recommend you watch the videos that I described in the index.html file to find out where to go to learn how this works. OnServiceConnected gets called back if the service crashes and is no longer available, and you have to basically just kind of null things out so that it won't think it's connected. Here is the constructor. This goes ahead and makes a new messenger. Remember, if you watch the videos, you'll see a messenger is a means for being able to pass messages from one address space to another. It uses, underneath the hood, the messenger mechanism in Android uses the Android binder IPC framework, And so it's basically a wrapper around the binder, and it allows you to be able to send messages, and the messages can contain all the things that go into a message, and that information will all be bundled up and transferred over to the other process where the messenger resides. So we're going to end up passing a reference to the messenger, which gets turned into a proxy to the messenger, and that'll then be passed to the other address space. So we're going to create the reply messenger on the client side, and then that's going to get passed over to the bound service. Here's the bind service method. You have to figure out how to go ahead and implement the to-do tags here, and it gives you some overview of what to do. Basically, you'll be creating a new intent using the factory method inside of download images bound service to make the appropriate kind of intent. And that intent will then be used to resolve the bind service call when it's called, and you'll have to pass in the service connection and some other stuff. Watch the videos, they'll show you how to do it. So that's how you do the binding. And then unbind service gets called back under certain circumstances, and that will call an unbind service call, which will do some magic to unbind the service and then set a field to null. Here's the start download method. So you can see that when start download is called, what we do is we come along and we first check to make sure that we're bound to the service. If not, we're not bound, so that's a problem. Otherwise, if we're bound to the service, we go ahead and we make ourselves a request message, and we use the make request message factory method on the request message class in order to say, I want to make a message that will be a download image request at this URL with this directory path and with this reference to a reply messenger. So we're passing a reference to the reply messenger, which will be turned into a proxy on the receiver side. And that message is then going to be sent to the download images bound service. So that message will then be sent off, and that's the code, of course, that you have to fill in. So this is basically the client side of the bound service. And of course, the client in this case resides in the model layer itself. So it's in the model layer, it's the client side of the model. You also have to fill in the started service implementation, but that's just taking what you did for assignment 1. Here then are the reply and request messages. This code is basically the same as for assignment 1. You'll have to fill it in using what you did for assignment 1. So I won't walk through that again. Hopefully you understand what that does. That's just being used to pass the messages between the client, which is in the model layer of the application, and you send a request message over to the bound service, and that request message is then cracked open, analyzed, and then used to download the appropriate file, store that file in the right place, and then a reply message is created and sent back to the handler that resides over here in the model layer. Let's go take a look at the services implementations. Again, we have a bound service implementation and a started service implementation. Your started service implementation will ultimately just be the one that you used for assignment 1. And here's the skeleton for the bound service implementation. So you can see here that we're going to end up having a download images bound service, which is a lifecycle logging service. And this is going to basically keep a request handler. It's going to make a request handler. It's going to pass a reference to that request handler out to the client as part of the onBind hook method. And then we're also going to have a messenger that's going to encapsulate this request handler. And that's what's going to actually get sent out, not the request handler itself, but a messenger that encapsulates it. Here is the request handler class. Request handler extends handler, and it's going to store a weak reference to the service. It's also going to contain an executor service implementation. If you watch the videos, you'll learn about executor service. And we talked about executor service actually in the previous MOOC, the POSA concurrency MOOC. And hopefully everybody realizes that you need to have taken, or you need to have mastered the information in the first MOOC in order to make any sense of this MOOC. That's why they're part of a specialization. Here's the constructor for this. We go ahead and create a weak reference to the service, and we create an executor service that manages a pool of threads. In this case, we're going to use a cached thread pool. We could have used a fixed size thread pool. And that means the thread pool is up and running. And then when we get a handle message request called on us, that'll get called when the client sends us a message. That will go ahead and convert the message into a request message. And then you have to write the code described here to crack open that message using the methods defined in the base class of request message. Crack it open, get it, and then use those things in order to be able to create a runnable. And this runnable is actually going to execute in the executor services thread pool. And when its run method is called, it's going to turn around and download the image from the remote server. And then it'll take the URI that it downloaded it into, and it's going to send that back to the caller, which is the client we talked about before. It's going to send that back via a send call on the reply messenger. So that'll go scooting back over to the client side. So you have to fill in that code, and then here's the send path method. And all I would do here is I would basically do all the things you need to do here in order to get the information you need that you've downloaded. And I would call send path. Here's send path. Send path takes a messenger, the path to the image file, the original URL where the image was downloaded from, and the request code that was passed in. And it'll turn around and then make the reply message via the reply message factory method. And then it'll go ahead and send that message back to the activity. So that'll get sent back. And you have to fill in the shutdown method that shuts down the executor service when you're all done. You have to fill in the method that makes the intent. So you have to make the appropriate intent to download the image. That's pretty straightforward. Making those intents is pretty easy in this case. And you have to fill in the code that will create the request handler and the messenger that encapsulates the request handler. Just giving you a little practice with making handlers and messengers. And then here's the onBind hook method. This is the method that's called automatically by Android, the bound service framework implementation, to get the iBinder that's associated with the request messenger. And that's what's going to get returned back to the client via the onService connected hook method. So that's going to get sent back to the client. The client will use that as part of the handshake in order to get everything all set up in order to do the call. And then there's also an onDestroy method, and the onDestroy method will basically be used to shut things down. And that's just to kind of clean up the resources. Okay, so that's basically what we're doing here. You can see there's a bit more going on in this implementation than was going on in the started service. And the reason for that, of course, is that the bound service has a few more steps to be taken care of, because you've got this handshake that takes place with bind service, which is called on the client side, which triggers a call to the onBind method on the service side, which triggers a call to onService connected back on the client side. And only after all those calls complete can you actually start to do the work. And in contrast, the code for doing a started service is a little simpler, although you still end up doing more or less the same thing with respect to passing information back and forth in messages. Okay. So that was the overview of the skeleton for the assignment. And at this point, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have, if you have any questions, and be happy to give you any pointers. We can talk about the previous assignment, assignment 1. If you have any questions about assignment 1, I'll be happy to talk about assignment 2. Just go ahead and let me know what you would like to talk about. And I'll wait for I'll wait a minute or two, because I know there's a latency issue involved here, and so you don't get the response at your end quite as fast as I'm speaking it. So it might take you a few minutes to hear this and then type your question into the QA section and send it back. So I'll just give a second and wait. Well, so far it doesn't look like there's any questions. So I will take that as a sign that either the latency is very high and you haven't heard my request for questions yet, or the explanation I gave of the skeletons is so incredibly compelling and comprehensive that nobody had anything that they wanted to ask, which is fine too. So while I'm waiting to see if anybody has any questions, let me go show you a little bit about some of the deadlines that we have coming up. Let's see if I can share the screen for that. Let's see, we'll share the screen for Google Hangout. Let me go over here. Course. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, so if you take a look at the programming assignments down here, then you'll see that we have deadlines on these assignments. The deadline for assignment number 1, which is the assignment we gave out last week, is Monday the 21st. And I made it Monday the 21st just because it's kind of pushing it to make it a little bit later in the week. People start sort of dropping off, and but I'd be happy to move it back a couple days if people feel that would be helpful. Notice, by the way, if you go and take a look at the assignment, it's actually the review of this thing is not going to be due until after the new year. So you have plenty of time to review it once it's been submitted. Likewise, assignment number 2 is not due until the 6th of January. So you have an enormous amount of time to work on that one. I don't think it'll take people nearly that long, but we want to be sensitive to the fact that it's a holiday season for many people. And so as a result, we didn't want to make you assume you had to do a lot of work over the holidays, since we don't expect our students here at Vanderbilt to do work over the holidays, and so we didn't expect you to do it either. But obviously, that'll give you plenty of time to get this done if you'd like to. So the assignments are up here. Feel free to take a look, and that can help you. Looked like there was a question over here. Let me see if I can answer the question. Let's see. Oh, somebody was asking a question, so they answered their own question. That's good. All right, good news. So a couple questions have come in. If you take a look, you'll see the deadlines for everything. If you click on those links, you'll see when the deadlines are for all the stuff. Someone wanted to move the second deadline to January 6th. No, we got to kind of keep it that way, because otherwise we start running out of time, unfortunately, for the final assignment. And I think at this point we're giving quite a long time to do that. We'll have to see how it goes, though. I'm not going to be as long as we can get everything done by the end of the class. That's the key thing. Okay, so it looks like people had all their questions answered. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to go out to the course website and feel free to ask them on the discussion forums. And we'll probably have another live lecture and virtual office hours after the holidays. And in the meantime, I will be happy to keep working with people through the discussion forums. Thank you very much for joining. That's good.